For the sake of time, I'm not going to go over and review what we talked about last week. If you want to know what we talked about last week, it's on YouTube, so you go look at it. But this morning, we are in verses 9 through 13 of Genesis chapter 1. And this morning, I'll repeat some things that have already been said. And to sort of start, I'm going to present some things to you as well, play devil's advocate a little. Well, maybe not devil's advocate, but I'm going to tell you what I don't believe and then maybe tell you what I do. And you might be on one side or the other. But to start, I just want to reinforce some things. The main one that's going to come up over and over this morning is who Genesis was written for initially. And like I said, this will come up multiple times throughout the lesson this morning, but Revelation was not written to you and I. Neither was Genesis. Neither were any of the books in between. They were written to people during a time, about a thing, for a reason. Now, that doesn't mean it's not for us today, but what you're going to find in verses 9 through 13, I'll give some of the class away now, is that we're going to look at the creation, and that was not written for you and I today to form necessarily. It wasn't written for you and I today to have our beliefs and to push off evolution and that sort of thing. It's not the scientific reasoning behind things. It was written to the children of Israel who are getting ready to go into the promised land. They're going to go into Canaan. They're going to find all kinds of people who believe all kinds of crazy things, and they're going to encounter hundreds of gods, lowercase g gods, and pagan teachings. So there's going to be a God who is praised for his great wisdom. And then there's going to be a God that they worship for creating the world. And then there is a God that they worship that created man. And there's a God that they worship who fertilizes the world and creates offspring and growth and abundant crops. And so Moses, again, we don't know for sure, but we're pretty sure. Moses writes Genesis to the children of Israel overall to explain to them, especially the first 11 chapters. You need to know who God is, the one true God, who he is, what he does, what he's like, so that you can know how you're supposed to be. This is God. You are his children, so you be like God. But these verses that we're going to look at today is Moses' explanation to them of, listen, this is how things actually came to be. Because when they enter into the promised land, they're going to hear all sorts of wacky stuff about how things came to be. This God gave us this God gave us that, this God gave us this. And so Moses is getting ahead of that. So I'll repeat that part again. Genesis chapter 1 was not written to give us scientific information, although the information here in Genesis chapter 1 is scientifically accurate. We find that over and over again. Genesis chapter 1 is theological. It's talking about God. It is telling these people, this is God. It's theological, not scientific, although it does serve a scientific purpose. There's one all-wise, all-powerful, all-knowing, faithful, loving God. Just one. There is one. I wanted to bring a rock with me this morning. And where we live in Edmond, on Santa Fe trails, it's these big, dusty, red rocks. And I mean, we've got great big ones in our backyard, just massive, like half set into the ground. And so I didn't really see one that I could just sort of pick up and bring with me. And I was going to message one of you and ask you to bring a rock, and then I thought that sounded dumb, so I didn't do that. But if you could just imagine a rock here, and they didn't have any in the parking lot, I looked. So if you could just imagine if I had a rock here any rock, the rock in your yard, whatever. And I might ask you, how old is that rock? And what would your answer be? If I did pull a rock out of the parking lot and I had it up here, how old would that rock be? Huh? Old. Yeah. Well, there aren't new rocks necessarily like sprouting out of the ground, right? So it would be somewhat fair to reason that that rock would be roughly as old as the earth is. It might have broken off of something much larger, but that rock has just been here. So how old is the rock? Maybe as old as the earth. And then we're met with the question, well, then how old is the earth? So I don't know where we're at right now, to be completely honest. I think we're still at roughly 4.5 billion years old. Some scientists have doubled that, and we're closer to like 9 billion years old is the age of the earth, I think. That's a pretty wide range, isn't it? 4.5 billion to 9 billion years old is how old the earth is. And so, assumably, would be roughly how old that rock is. Could that be true? Could 4.5, we'll go with 4.5 billion. Could 4.5 billion years be true? That's how long the earth has existed. Well, you obviously can kind of tell where I'm going to come from with that. I'm not an evolutionist. I'm a creationist. And so I believe in the creation. God created the world. A little bit of devil's advocacy here, or just to kind of play both sides. That doesn't necessarily mean that this rock that I do not have, or that the earth has to be young. Again, don't look at me too strangely. I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit. Here's what I mean. There's two views of creationism. So we're putting macroevolution aside. We're saying we believe God created the world, so we are creationists. But there's two views of creationism. And so one of them would be progressive creation view. And so this is the idea that God created the world, and you've probably heard this before, but we don't know how long each day was. That's the progressive view of creationism. God created the world in 6 days, but who knows how long those 6 days were? Each day might have been a long period of time. And if you look at the Hebrew, because this is the Old Testament, that doesn't help us a whole lot more. The Hebrew word for day is yom. And it's kind of hard to know exactly what yom is referring to. And they'll point out events in progressive creationism that took place on the 6th day. And they say, well, the stuff that happens on day 6 could not have happened in one 24-hour day. And then they'll also point out the solar day as we know it, which is, again, 24. The time it takes for the Earth the sun to orbit to Earth, could not have existed before the sun and moon were created on the 4th day. So were the first 3 days of creation incredibly long, or who knows? And then day 4, the sun and the moon are created, which then creates this 24-hour orbit. And so now we have a 24-hour day, and so days, we'll say 5 and 6 were 24-hour days, but the first 4 maybe were longer. Anyways, that's where they're coming from. That would be the progressive creationists who conclude that we don't know how long the days of creation were. They could have been long periods of time, and so the rock in your backyard could be 4.5 billion years old if the first 4 days were, like 1 billion years apiece in our time, right? Sure, maybe. I'm not going to disfellowship you if you have more of a progressive creationist view, but that's not my view. And that might be your view. It may not be your view. Because the other way of viewing creationism is the 6-day, 24-hour creationist view, which is what I've been taught, and that's how I've been raised, and that's what I believe, and I'll give you one reason, and it's not the best, but I'll dispense that to you. I think that there were 6 24-hour days in which God created the world. Again, that's to the best of my ability, and you might disagree, and I think that can be okay. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, when God gives the 10 commandments, and when he comes to the 4th commandment about keeping the Sabbath, what is being said is, in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that's in them, and rested on the 7th day. That may not be the best explanation for you on a 6 24-hour day view, but I think it's pretty clear to the Hebrews when Moses gave this command of the 4th commandment that he is talking about 6 solar days. Otherwise, we've got a super wacky communication here where Moses comes down and says, as he's giving the commandments, and in 6 days, well, 4 billion year time, you guys don't know what billion means, but 4 really long days, and then 2 much shorter days like we have now. In that amount of time, the Lord created this. That's not what's said. It's very clear. Look, at this time, when the commandments are given, there are 24-hour days. And it's very clear in the Hebrew, 6 days the Lord created the heavens and the earth, he rested on the 7th. And there isn't a further explanation of, well, but you guys remember the first 4 days, the sun and the moon didn't exactly exist, so they were really long. Maybe, but there's just there's no dialogue of that. So it makes more sense to me that it says 6 days, Moses tells them, 6 days the Lord created the heavens and the earth. And that tells me that he's talking to people who understand the 24-hour day. That tells me 6 24-hour days. Any thoughts on that before we keep going?
6 days, how long ago?
Long time ago.
Well,
yeah.
You certainly got plenty of religious people that specifically date the earth at 6,000 years.
Yeah.
Because through the lineage that's given to us, so was it 6 days and 7 or 6,000 years and 7 days ago?
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely get into some lineage stuff here pretty soon, which is going to date some things more for us. That is a good question, though. Like I said, which we will get to. I do have 6,000 years written down here.
Of course you do. but because it's written there, it doesn't tell me anything. Where did they come up with 6,000 years?
Sure. We'll get to the lineage, and when we get through that, I promise we'll get to that.
My water's not running too deep, but the way I speculate that, God can do something in the twinkling of an eye. It don't take him long to make something.
True.
He could have just done that instantly, and that was the day's work. That's just the way I feel.
Sure. I don't want to get too much into it because it kind of hurt my brain, but I was in a wedding on Thursday, and one of the other groomsmen is very adamantly, which we'll talk about briefly here, he's very adamantly flat earth, believes in the flat earth. And so me and Josh Basic was also in that wedding, so he and I sat down with it after the wedding. We sat there at the front, there's people dancing on the dance floor, and we're talking about moral objective truth. But it was a good conversation, but it's just, especially when Josh is around and somebody's being outspoken about their belief, Josh is going to come in and start asking vague questions to get them to admit things. But that was part of the conversation we had where he admitted that he hasn't really read the whole Bible, but there are certain things that it says God did this and God did that, and I just don't believe that. I don't think that that's possible. And the conversation there that we ended up having with him was similar to what Glenn just said, which is, I think it's a good thing that you can't wrap your head around God's ability to do something. So we might say, well, it's impossible for God to have created all of that in 6 24-hour days. But as Glenn would say, God can do literally anything, in the twinkling of an eye. So why couldn't he create all those things in a 24-hour day? Why not? Which we'll get to here in just a moment as well. The when matters much less than the why.
Because there's scripture that says, in heaven, a day is as 1,000 years,
Sure.
1,000 years is as a day. So you can take that however you want. Ultimately, it's irrelevant, and the reason why is because we're taught to come to faith as children.
Mm-hmm.
And as children, the way children perceive things, what you're told, that's what's accepted. To children, things just are as they are. And
Mhm.
God is saying, this just is how it is.
Sure.
Trying to get into the fine details of things is where humans try to play God. And humanity's going to pay dearly for trying to play God. We're starting to see how that's unfolding with
Mhm.
technology. And there's a price to pay when you try to make things so complicated that you're not supposed to understand.
Mhm.
You don't really need to understand because we're taught to come to it as children. So the time factor is irrelevant.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get to that here in just a second. I agree with that, but for the sake of, just like what we did with Revelation, sure, some of the imagery and why does this say this? I also just don't want to just skip over that either. But we'll get to the fact that the when matters much less than the why. So something else that I'll kind of throw in when it comes to the dating of things. When we're talking about a young earth, by the way, we don't know how long the earth was formless and void and covered in darkness. We know that it was, and then God begins creating. What's the timeline there, right? And then another thing, when it comes to determining the age of that rock in your backyard, remembering the fact that God built age into his creation. For example, when he created Adam was an adult man. He wasn't, or at least he wasn't a newborn baby. Now, are we talking 18? Are we talking 35, 42, 50? I don't know. But he was an adult man. And so he's made with age built in. God created him with age. So, again, this kind of hurts to think about, but maybe the rock that's in your backyard has the appearance of something that has been there for 4.5 billion years, and it may only be 6,000 years old or more or less, give or take. So if people say that we've looked at the earth and we've studied the ground and we've dug through the dirt and the rocks and things like that, and it tells us that the earth is very old, well, it very well could be very old, because everything was made with age built in. Just throwing that out there. But we come to what Dustin was just saying, which is we don't think of it this way, but when we focus so hard on how long were the 6 days, and if God built things with age, maybe the earth is 4.5 billion years old because God made it to look like it was 4.5 billion years old, even though it's only 6,000 years. When you start doing that, you're doing the same stuff you do with Revelation, where Moses is writing this to tell the children of Israel who God is, and you and I, again, when we study Scripture, should come at it from the direction of this is who wrote it and who they wrote it to and why. But you and I read Genesis chapter 1 and we say, okay, how long exactly was creation and what were the steps taken and how old is the earth right now? And we try and math all that out, and it's the same stuff people do with Revelation where you're like, okay, so there's going to be a lady and she's going to be on a dragon, and is that talking about China or is that talking about Russia, or are we... And you're doing the same stuff. And you're trying to make Genesis answer questions it's not intended to answer. Now, as I've already said, and Dustin has said, I am not so sure that when all this happened is nearly as important as why, which is what we'll get into now. Isaiah 45 verse 18 said, God created the earth to be inhabited. Psalm 115 says, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he's given to the sons of men. I've made this one's mine. I've made that, this one's yours. And God's creative work, then, what we read here, what Moses is telling the children of Israel, is that God's creative work is intended, or was intended to prepare the world for men. And that meant that certain conditions on the earth had to change so that earth could fulfill that purpose for mankind. So something, just a small thing, I'm not trying to put too much stock in this. When God creates the heavens and the earth in verse 1 and 2, he doesn't say anything about that. He creates the heavens, he creates the earth, which is this formless void. He says nothing. And now, or here pretty soon, we're going to go through day 1, day 2, day 3, and after each of those days, he's going to say, it's good. Something interesting to point out. So he's created the heavens and the earth. The earth is formless. It's void. He makes it, or wants it to be inhabitable for man, so he makes it, and it's not good yet, but he's going to make it good. Or at least he doesn't say anything. He makes it, and then he starts putting things on it, and each time he says, that's good. This is good. Good for man. That's good. So he only says it's good after he's creating things for man to live on the earth and changing the conditions for us. So let's go through day by day, and I'll kind of give my thoughts there, and you can give yours. But day 1, the first condition that God changes so that man can live on earth is he separates the light from the darkness. I'll remind you that the sun and moon are not designated as light givers until the 4th day. So there's probably some questions there on what light is he separating from what darkness? Or is darkness just there, and again, where is this light coming from? We could immediately say we don't know for sure what light that is, but we could also conclude from various other scriptures that God himself is the source of light. In Revelation, we read that 2 times. That heaven is not going to need a sun because God himself is the source of light. From the earliest part of the Bible, we're being told right here, God can dispel any darkness. God has that power. If there's darkness, God can just light that thing up. So he dispels darkness in man's heart. He dispels the darkness that Satan is putting on unbelievers so that they can see the glory of Christ. And so it seems very probable that God is the source of light. And here on day 1, the first thing he does is he says there's light and there's dark. Day 2, God created an atmosphere that can create life. And this is when we start getting into some different beliefs, right? Like I had to deal with this week. But he separated the waters below from the waters above with an expanse in between. And we can talk about what that might have looked like and why that would be the case. If we're arguing why God would do that, then most scholars would believe that at one time the earth had a great canopy of water above it, and that would have created essentially a greenhouse effect, which would have kept the climate really nice and would have kept the vegetation very plush, and it would have made the whole world a paradise for man. No, and then we're going to see later on when the flood comes, that breaks and the waters come. But that's all I've got to say on that for now. Day 3, God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place and let the dry ground appear. God said, let the land produce vegetation, plants bearing seed, fruit trees bearing fruit after their own kind. And that is the first kind of, because there's different kinds, that is the first kind of life on planet. There's things that grow, and from them they grow seeds, they grow fruit, they bear fruit. And again, this is important from the direction of who this was written to, because Moses is saying God creates fertility. And remember, the Israelites are getting ready to go into the land of Canaan, and they're going to encounter, specifically here, the god of Baal. And people worshipped Baal because the god Baal promises fertility. He's the god who brings forth rain and the crops. And so Moses is making the point here very specifically, God makes the crops grow, and it's God who has made the ground fertile and productive, not Baal. So that's the point being made there. Day 4, God creates the sun, or the greater light, and the moon, or the lesser light, and the stars. And I'll just say one thing here about that. They are to be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. Why the sun? Why a greater light? Why a lesser light? Why these stars? Well, those are for signs, for seasons, to mark days, to mark years. That's why. Again, Moses is making a very clear point here, as he is with each thing. These things are not to be worshipped. They were created by God to make the world inhabitable for you. These things that God has made serve you. And one of the big religions that the Israelites are going to encounter, which is still a big part of things today, is when they enter into the land of Canaan, they're going to run into lots of people who follow astrology. And so this is a reassurance to God's people that the heavenly bodies are not to be worshipped. These things that are up there were made to serve them. I know very little about astrology. Haven't looked into it, don't really care. I could not tell you what my sign is, but it might be of interest to you, maybe, I don't know, to dabble with astrology charts or to read horoscopes, which I think is especially silly. But remember this verse here, remember day 4, and the purpose for what these things are to be. And then when you get a chance, look at Deuteronomy and Isaiah to see what God says about astrology, more specifically about what the sun, the moon, and the stars are meant for, really. They were made to be signs for the beginning of the day, the end of the day. They marked seasons throughout the year. They marked the beginning and the ends of years. And to give light and to reflect God's glory. Hey, God made that. How neat is that? That's what those things are meant for, and we need to use them for what God has intended them for. And we largely have. But a lot of people, even in the land of Canaan, as Israelites are getting ready to go into, people are using them for pretty strange things, horoscopes and astrology charts and things like that. That's not what those things are meant for. Day 5, God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth." The Hebrew word for creature is nepesh, and this is another kind of life. So we've got plants that have seeds. We have trees that bear fruit. That's a kind of life. On day 5, we have creatures. Let the waters teem with swarms of living nepesh, and let the birds fly above the earth. And the word nepesh is creature, but it refers specifically to soul life. Here's what I mean by that, or here's what is meant by that. On day 5, God has created things that have an awareness of their lives. They have consciousness. There is a level of intelligence there. If you have a dog, think about your dog, right? And now this is the waters teeming with Nepesh, but again, we can think of all kinds of creatures that they're not completely dumb. They know that they're alive. They know when they're hungry. They need to go get food. They have tools that they use to do that. It's intelligently designed. They're conscious of their life. And we won't get to it today, Lord willing, this will be next week. It's the same word used for Adam. Nepesh, soul life. Because Adam is also conscious of his life, and he's intelligent, and those sorts of things. Now, Adam is created with something a little bit different, which, like I said, we won't get to today, Lord willing, next week. But Nepesh, same word for Adam as well in chapter 2, which is referring to him as a living being. These things are alive, and they know it. And something else to notice here, God didn't bless the plants, but he blesses the animals. In a sense, the blessing, more specifically here, in the sense of giving them the gift of reproduction. In other words, it is a blessing from God to have consciousness, to have some level of intelligence, and to be able to relate intimately with another of your kind. Is a blessing that God bestows here. And then day 6. And that's, first, God creates the creatures, the Nepesh, for the land. We had, let the waters teem with Nepesh, now the land. And in the Hebrew, it says he created 3 kinds of creatures. We have the word cattle, and that word, fortunately, maybe unfortunately, the word cattle there actually indicates the dumb or docile beasts. And then he creates creepers, my least favorite. He makes insects and spiders, amphibians. I'm cool with those. Things that crawl on the ground, that's fine. Not cool with flying stuff. Not into that. But he creates creepers. And then he creates the beasts of the earth, which are just wild animals. Let's see. We've got about roughly 9-10 minutes left. Something interesting here. I think we all know this. I've pointed it out recently, actually, but all the animals created on the 6th day would have originally been vegetarian. Verse 29. God said, "Behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that's on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be good for you, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I've given every green plant for food." And it was so. Now, is God saying that we should be vegetarian? Well, I'm speaking ahead of myself a little bit here, but when we get to Genesis chapter 9 and after the flood, we start seeing the eating of animals. In fact, when Adam and Eve are no longer in the garden, we see death, which is, an animal is dead, and they create, or clothes are created for them. But it isn't until after the flood that we start talking about eating animals. And no, that is not condemned, by the way. But if we go back to where we are right here, the account of creation, and all these things are made, we get to the Nepesh, and they've been given every green plant for food. So if the creation of animals were not made for man to eat, and they were not necessary to kill for clothing, because up to a certain point, right, they are naked but without shame. So they don't eat them, and they don't kill them for shelter or for clothing. What on earth are these animals for? I would dare say it's very possible that God created the animals strictly for man's fascination. We could also get into the fact that, yes, but God also knows that somewhere here down the line, yes, okay. But I would also dare say that creation is made to make the world inhabitable for man and a little bit for man's fascination. Man is going to see these living creatures. There's things flying in the sky. I mean, listen, we got a part of Dottie's birthday gift from her grandparents is a zoo pass. So we can all go to the zoo for a year. We got a zoo pass for the year. Listen, I've seen those things 100 times. They took Dottie at like 8 months. She could not have cared less. She's older now, right? And will continue, Lord willing, to get older. And when we take her to the zoo, that's going to blow her mind. There's little things that are fast, and there's these great big things. And look at that thing with those big ears and the trunk, and that thing has a giant neck. And then there's stuff in the water, and there's things flying, and they live in the trees. And from a child's perspective, right, which I wish we could go back to sometimes, but they look at those things, and that's nuts. That's crazy. Where do those things come from? Clear back in Genesis chapter 1, and God says, I'm going to make the world inhabitable for man, and that's the last thing he makes, because everything up to that point is the light and the darkness and the land and the sea, and then he says, let's fill these things with creatures, dumb and docile and little creeping things and things that crawl on their belly and all sorts of stuff. And then God creates man, and that's the big, that's the climax, that's the crowning point of his creation, that's the focal point. That's, again, Isaiah chapter 48, God created the world to be inhabitable for man. And again, Lord willing, we'll talk more about that next week. But I'll try and close quickly with a couple things to take away this morning for you. The first one is God's pleasure in his creation. God makes these things each day and says, this is good. God liked that. He made these things. He said, this is good. And man sins and causes the ground to be cursed. And that doesn't mean, and again, we'll get to that eventually, that doesn't mean God is so preoccupied with man's fall that he forgets the rest of his creation. In fact, in Genesis 9, after the flood, God makes a covenant with man, but he makes it with all living creatures. When you think about it, I'm not going to flood the earth again. He didn't just have to put Noah on the ark. He had to put the animals on there too to save them. And God says, I will never flood the earth again. And that's for man, but that's also for what he's created. I'm not going to do that again. Psalm 145, verse 9, the Lord is good to all, and his mercies are over all of his works. Luke chapter 12, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents, and yet not one of them is forgotten before God. It seems that God seems to have a real concern and care for his creation, and we should take pleasure in what God has made, because God takes pleasure in what he's made. Again, to go back to that childlike fascination and say, listen, this stuff is really cool. And when God, just imagine when God is making these things, he says, that's good. This is good. And I'm not going to be, I don't know what you want to call me, I'm not going to be a hippie or whatever you would call it today. But I would also say that we should also share a concern and a love for God's creation, take pleasure in that, but also be extremely careful with it, with the polluting of it, with the destroying of it, those sorts of things. It makes no sense and it's no good to maliciously destroy God's creation with no regard for who made it and why he made it. That's all I'll say about that. Something else really quick. Creation should teach us to be reverent. Romans chapter 1 is where I go to every time for that. verse 20 in Romans chapter 1, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made." That's partially what Moses is writing to the children of Israel about. This is God. He's done these incredible things, and he's done it for you. The reason that's brought up in Romans chapter 1 is because Paul is dealing with people who are worshiping, just as the people in Canaan are worshiping the creation and not the Creator. And so Moses is getting ahead of that and saying, you're going to hear some people say we should worship this God and this one, and we should worship this animal and this thing, and we should do astrology and follow the stars and the moon and the sun. Forget all that mess. Worship the God who made all of those things. We've kind of gone over gratefulness already. We should be grateful for what God's created for us. And the last thing I'll give you, which is one that's important for me as well personally, creation is supposed to teach us to not worry. Matthew 6:26, "Look at the birds of the air, and that they do not sow, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not worth much more than them?" And then further down in verse 30, "Observe the lilies of the field and how they grow. They don't toil, they don't spin, and yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory did not clothe himself like one of these. But if God so arrays the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more do so for you?" God made you, and you are the pinnacle of his creation. He's created the lilies of the field. He's created the birds in the air and the creatures and the beasts, and he loves and cares for his creation. And if he loves and cares for those things, would he not care much more for man? Which, again, we'll talk more about, Lord willing, next week. 9:45, perfect timing. Are there any thoughts or questions or anything about that stuff this morning? Cool deal. Thanks, guys.